The moment Maria Carter rode into Dusthaven, Texas, in the spring of 1878, every soul on that sun-baked Main Street turned to look at her, and not one of them could decide whether she was the bravest woman they had ever seen or the most foolish. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and brown-eyed, with calloused hands that told the story of a life lived hard, and a jaw set in a way that said she had no intention of apologizing for it. She sat straight in the saddle on a roan mare that was too thin for the distance she had traveled, her single saddlebag worn through at the bottom and patched with a strip of leather that had once been a belt. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, where the cattle drives thundered through and left nothing but dust and broken promises behind them, and she had come because a letter had arrived at the boarding house where she worked, a letter written in careful schoolteacher script by a woman named Mrs. Hattie Drummond, who ran the general store in Dusthaven, and who had written on behalf of the town that there was work here, honest work, for a woman who was not afraid of it. What Mrs. Drummond had not written, and what Maria discovered within the first hour of her arrival, was that the work in question involved keeping house and managing the affairs of the Ellsworth Ranch, a sprawling piece of land 3 miles east of town that had once been the finest operation in Crockett County, and had since become something closer to a cautionary tale. "You need to understand something before you ride out there," Mrs. Drummond said, setting a tin cup of coffee in front of Maria and folding her broad hands on the counter with the gravity of a woman delivering a sermon. She was a stout woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes that nevertheless held within them a practiced wariness. "Joel Ellsworth is not an easy man. He has not been easy since the war, and he has gotten considerably less easy since his wife passed 2 winters ago." Maria wrapped both hands around the tin cup and felt the warmth travel up through her palms. "How did she pass?" "Fever. It took her fast. They had a little boy too, Thomas. He is 6 years old now, and he is the only reason Joel has not drunk himself into the ground entirely, as best anyone can tell." Mrs. Drummond studied Maria with frank appraisal. 3 women have gone out to that ranch to help in the past year. 3 women have come back inside of a week. The last one said Joel Ellsworth looked at her like she was a trespasser in his own home and never spoke a single word to her the whole 4 days she was there. "What happened to the little boy? Who has been tending to him?" "A Tejano woman named Rosa Vega comes in from the neighboring property twice a week. She does what she can, but she has her own family to see to." Mrs. Drummond tilted her head. "You are not asking the questions I expected you to ask." "What questions did you expect? Most women ask whether he is dangerous." Maria took a slow sip of her coffee and set the cup down. "Is he?" "Not to anyone else, Mrs. Drummond said it quietly and with a particular weight that Maria understood without needing it explained. "Some men turn their broken edges outward and cut everyone around them. Some men turn them inward instead. He is just very, very lost, and this town needs that ranch to survive. Joel's father built the water rights agreement that keeps half our farms fed. If the ranch collapses, and it will collapse if someone does not put it in order, 3 families besides his own will lose their livelihoods." Maria was quiet for a moment. Through the dusty window of the general store she could see the main street of Dusthaven baking in the afternoon light, a blacksmith's shop, a livery, a small white church with a crooked steeple, the kind of town that had been built on the backs of people who had very little and wanted very much and would not stop working until they got it or died trying. She recognized it the way you recognize your own face. "I will go," she said simply. Mrs. Drummond let out a long breath. "Maria Carter, I will tell you what I told the others, and I want you to hear it more seriously than they did. Joel Ellsworth is broken beyond saving. That is not a cruel thing to say. It is just the truth as I have watched it unfold over the past 7 years. He came back from the war a changed man, and then grief took what was left and shook it to pieces. You can manage the house, you can tend to the boy, and that will be a mercy, but do not go out there thinking you are going to fix him." Maria stood, settled her hat back on her head, and picked up her saddlebag. She looked at Mrs. Drummond with an expression that was neither boastful nor reckless, just very calm and very certain. "Broken things," she said, "are the only kind I know how to love." She rode out before Mrs. Drummond could find the words to answer that. The Ellsworth ranch revealed itself to Maria slowly as the road east gave way to a long, flat approach through scrub brush and mesquite, the kind of land that looked spare and unwelcoming, until you had lived with it long enough to see that it was actually just honest. What it had, it showed you. What it lacked, it did not pretend to have. The main house was a solid two-story structure built from limestone and timber, the kind of construction that said someone had once cared very much about permanence. But the front porch railing had rotted at one end and sagged to the ground, and the kitchen garden beside the house had gone entirely to weeds, and 3 fence posts along the nearest paddock had fallen and not been replaced, leaving a gap through which the wind moved like it owned the place. A small boy was sitting on the front porch steps when Maria rode up, and he watched her approach with enormous dark eyes that were so serious and so watchful in a 6-year-old face that it made something in her chest pull tight. He had his father's coloring dark blonde hair gone lighter at the tips from the sun, and he was wearing a shirt that had been washed so many times it was nearly translucent, but it was clean. That mattered. Someone was making sure it was clean. "Hello," Maria said, reining the mare in and swinging down from the saddle. "You must be Thomas." "Yes, ma'am." He did not move from the steps, but he did not look away from her either. "Are you going to leave like the others did?" She walked the horse to the hitching post and tied her off, then turned to face him fully. "I have not decided yet," she said honestly. "I just got here. It seems a little early to be leaving." Something shifted in his face, subtle and small, like a door opened just a crack. "The last lady cried, on the second day." "What made her cry?" Thomas looked down at his boots. "Papa does not talk very much, and when he does it is not very nice." "I see." Maria climbed the porch steps and stood beside him, looking out across the yard. From here she could see the barn, which was in better repair than the house, and a corral where 3 horses stood together in the afternoon shade, and beyond that, a figure moving along the fence line at the far edge of the property. Even at this distance, there was something in the way the man moved that told her everything Mrs. Drummond had said was true. He moved with the careful, deliberate heaviness of someone who was carrying more weight than could be seen. "Is that your papa?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. He works until dark. He does not come in for supper most nights." Maria nodded slowly. "Well," she said, "I suppose I had better see about this kitchen and figure out what there is to cook, because a man who works until dark has earned a hot supper whether he comes in for it or not." Thomas stared up at her. "You are going to leave food for him?" "I am going to cook food for him. What he does with it is his own business." She picked up her saddlebag and pushed open the front door. "Come and show me where things are. I will need your help." The boy scrambled up off the steps and followed her inside, and Maria thought that perhaps that was the first real thing she had accomplished, giving a 6-year-old a reason to move with purpose. The inside of the house was neither filthy nor cared for. It existed in the particular kind of neglect that comes not from laziness but from absence, from a person who was physically present but emotionally elsewhere. The floors were swept but not scrubbed. The dishes were clean but stacked without order. There was flour and cornmeal in the pantry, a side of salt pork hanging in the cool room, dried beans in a barrel, and a cast-iron stove that was cold but in good working condition. Someone had been doing the minimum required to keep things from falling apart entirely, and Maria suspected that someone was Thomas himself, working with his small hands at whatever he could reach. She found wood in the box beside the stove, got a fire going, and set beans on to soak while Thomas sat at the kitchen table and watched her with those serious eyes. She asked him questions as she worked, quiet, easy questions about which drawer held the good knife, and where his father kept the coffee, and whether the well in the yard was reliable. And the boy answered every one with a focused attention that broke her heart a little, because it was clear that he was not used to being asked things, not used to anyone treating his knowledge as useful or his presence as welcome. By the time the sun was touching the horizon, Maria had bean and salt pork stew going on the stove, a pan of cornbread baked and cooling on the table, and Thomas fed and washed and sitting with a book open in his lap near the lamp, looking more at ease than she suspected he had looked in a long time. She set a full bowl at the head of the table for Joel Ellsworth, covered it with a cloth to keep the heat in, and went about washing up. She heard his boots on the porch at full dark, the sound of them stopping outside the door, and then a long pause, as if the smell of a real cooked meal had arrested him on the threshold. When the door opened, Maria was drying her hands on a cloth and she turned to face him, and she had prepared herself for the sight of a broken man. But she had not entirely prepared herself for the particular way Joel Ellsworth was broken. He was 30 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who forgot to eat, with dark blonde hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, a kind of gray-green that seemed to shift depending on the light. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with effort, the kind of face that would have been very fine if its owner had any interest in it, and he clearly did not. There was a long scar along the left side of his jaw from the war, and his hands, Maria noticed, were very strong and very scarred in their own way, the hands of a man who had put them through hard use for a long time. But it was his eyes that told the real story. There was an exhaustion in them so profound it had gone past tired and past grief, and arrived somewhere closer to hollow, the look of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had simply decided that the carrying was now what he did, that there was nothing else, that there would not be anything else, and that this was acceptable. He looked at her. He looked at the stew on the stove and the cornbread on the table and his son asleep in the chair by the lamp, and his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes flickered like a candle in wind. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was low and rough and unused sounding like a gate that had not been opened in a season. "Maria Carter. Mrs. Drummond sent me. I'm here to help manage the house and see to Thomas." "I did not ask for help." "No," Maria agreed pleasantly. "I am aware of that. There is stew on the stove and cornbread on the table. Your bowl is covered to stay warm. Eat it or don't, that is entirely up to you." She folded the cloth and hung it over the edge of the basin. "I will be sleeping in the small room off the back. Good night, Mr. Ellsworth." She walked past him without waiting for a response, and she felt his eyes on her back the whole way down the hall. She lay awake for a long time that night listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of a coyote somewhere in the scrub, the wind moving through the gaps in the window frame. And then, after a long silence, the quiet sound of a spoon against the side of a bowl. He had eaten the stew. She allowed herself one small, private smile in the dark, and then she went to sleep. The first week on the Ellsworth ranch was not easy, but it was not the kind of hard that Maria had feared. Joel was not cruel. He was, exactly as Mrs. Drummond had described, simply absent in all the ways that mattered most. He rose before dawn and was out the door before Thomas woke. He came in after dark, ate whatever was left on the stove without sitting at the table, and went upstairs without a word. On the third day, Maria caught him watching her from the doorway of the kitchen, while she was teaching Thomas how to properly set a bread loaf, and when she looked up, he looked away and went back outside as if she had caught him doing something embarrassing. She had expected anger. What she had not expected was the shyness underneath it, the way a man who had decided not to exist in the world could still be startled into existing by the smell of bread or the sound of his son laughing. Thomas laughed for the first time on the fourth day. Maria had been trying to teach the roan mare some patience while Thomas watched from the fence, and the mare had decided instead to nudge Maria hard enough in the back to send her stumbling forward into the water trough. And the boy had burst out laughing with his whole small body, the kind of laugh that had clearly been stored up for a very long time and came out all at once. Maria had stood there dripping and grinning, and then they had both dissolved into it together, and she thought she heard, just faintly from the direction of the barn, the sound of a man stopping what he was doing. On the fifth day, Joel said 6 words to her voluntarily. He came in for supper slightly earlier than usual and found her struggling to rehang the kitchen window that had warped in its frame, and he stood there for a moment watching her wrestle with it before he said, "You are making it worse." She stepped back, "Then by all means." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, took hold of the window frame with both hands, gave it a precise and practiced knock with the heel of his palm, and it dropped back into its groove smooth and easy. He stepped back. "Thank you," Maria said. He nodded once and went back outside. She counted that as a victory. On the 7th day, Rosa Vega came by. A warm and formidable woman of about 40 with silver-streaked black hair, and the kind of calm authority that only comes from having managed everything around you for decades. She came ostensibly to check on Thomas, but Maria recognized the real reason immediately, which was to assess her. They sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while Thomas played in the yard, and Rosa studied Maria with intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. "The others left because they could not stand the silence," Rosa said finally. "One of them said it was like living with a ghost." "It is a little like that," Maria acknowledged. "But ghosts are not usually fixing fence posts at 5 in the morning." Rosa looked at her carefully. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone younger and more frightened, or someone older and more resigned." Rosa turned her coffee cup in her hands. "You are different." "I have met broken men before," Maria said simply. "My father was one. When I was growing up in Abilene, he was there, but he was not there. After my mother died, he just sort of disappeared into himself, and there was not very much left over for the rest of us. I had 2 younger sisters and a brother to look after." She looked out the window at the yard. "I'm not saying that made me a saint. I am saying it made me patient. And I know the difference between a man who is dangerous and a man who is just lost." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "Joel was not always like this. Before the war, he was the kind of man who sang while he worked. His father told me that. I knew him after he came back, but even then, even those first few years, you could see the person underneath. After Margaret died," she shook her head, "he went somewhere we cannot follow." "What was she like, Margaret?" "Gentle, quiet. She loved him very much, and I think that love was the last rope he was holding onto, and when she went—" Rosa made a small gesture with her hand that said the rest. Maria nodded slowly. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a man who had loved that deeply and lost it was not a man with nothing left inside him. He was a man with too much inside him, too much that he had locked away because there was nothing to do with it. She said instead, "How can I help Thomas most? What does he need most right now?" Rosa looked at her for a long moment, and Maria had the distinct sense that she had just passed some kind of test. "He needs someone to see him," Rosa said. "His father looks at him and sees Margaret, and it hurts too much to look for long. Thomas knows this. He is very smart. He tries to make himself invisible so as not to cause his father pain." She paused. "He should not have to do that. He is 6 years old." "No," Maria said, "he should not." After Rosa left, Maria went out into the yard and found Thomas poking at an anthill with a stick in the methodical, concentrated way of a child who was entirely alone in his explorations. She crouched down beside him and looked at the anthill seriously. "They have been building that for about a week," Thomas told her, pointing out the fresh mounded earth. "I have been watching them." "What have you learned?" He looked at her to see if she was making fun of him, found that she was not, and turned back to the anthill with a new kind of openness. "They carry things much heavier than they are, and they know exactly where to go, even without anyone telling them. And when part of the hill gets knocked down, they just start fixing it right away. They do not stop to be upset about it." Maria looked at this boy for a long, quiet moment. "That is a very intelligent observation," she said. Thomas ducked his head and smiled, small and private and very pleased. That evening, when Joel came in from the fields earlier than usual, perhaps drawn by the smell of the beef and onion pie Maria had managed from what was left in the larder, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and found Maria and Thomas sitting at the table together. Thomas reading aloud from a McGuffey reader in a careful, earnest voice, while Maria listened with genuine attention, correcting him gently when he stumbled on a word. Joel stood in the doorway long enough that Maria noticed him, but she did not look up, giving him the choice of whether to make himself known or not. He made himself known. He sat down at the far end of the table, and Maria heard Thomas's reading falter slightly, just for a moment, and then continue with a kind of careful determination. Joel did not pick up a book or a tool. He simply sat there and listened to his son read, and after a while his hands, which had been flat and tense on the table, slowly relaxed. When Thomas finished the passage, he looked up at Maria first, and she nodded encouragingly, and then he looked at his father. Joel said, "You read that well." Thomas went perfectly still for a second, the way a small animal goes still when something unexpected and important happens, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Papa." Joel nodded once, got up, and went upstairs. It was not much, but Maria, refilling the water pitcher at the sink, felt something in her loosen that had been held tight since she arrived, and she thought that a house where a father tells his son he did well, and a son says thank you, was not a house that was entirely empty of life. It was the beginning of something. She was sure of it, even if she could not have said exactly what. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, Joel Ellsworth spoke more than 10 words to her for the first time. He had come in from checking the eastern water line to find Maria on the porch roof with a hammer and a handful of nails, repairing a section that had rotted through and was letting rain in above the bedroom. She had found the problem that morning when she heard dripping and gone to investigate, and she had found the necessary materials in the barn without asking, and she had climbed up there without announcing herself, because there was no one around to announce herself to. She heard his horse come into the yard below and heard it stop. "What are you doing?" Joel's voice from below had a note in it that she had not heard before, something between alarm and exasperation. "What does it look like?" She drove in another nail without pausing. "It looks like you are going to fall off my roof." "I am not going to fall. I have excellent balance." She tested the repaired section with her palm and found it solid. This was letting rain in. The shingles needed replacing. "I found them in the barn." A pause from below. "I was going to do that." "When?" Another pause, longer. "When I got to it." Maria sat back on her heels and looked down at him. He was still on horseback, looking up at her with an expression that was the closest thing to animated she had seen on his face, his brow pulled together, and his mouth pressed in a line that was not quite disapproval. The late afternoon light was falling across the yard at a low angle, and it turned everything gold: the dust, the limestone walls, the color of his hair. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, "I have noticed roughly 14 things on this property that need immediate attention, 12 of which require no more than an afternoon's work and some basic materials. I have been here 3 weeks, and you have not once asked me whether I might help with any of them. I am very capable with a hammer. I also know how to rehang a door, plaster a wall, and replace a water pump gasket, because I spent 3 years helping to run a boarding house, and the man who owned the building believed that maintenance was a concept that applied only to next year." Something happened to his face. The line of his mouth softened just frankly. "You ran a boarding house." "Helped run one." The owner was a Mrs. Clara Finch, who was 70 years old and had a very strong opinion about everything except the state of her roof. Maria climbed carefully down from the porch roof, using the window ledge as a foothold, and dropped the last few feet to the porch boards. She looked up at Joel, who was still on his horse, looking down at her. "I also cleaned out your cellar this morning while Thomas was at his schoolwork. There were potatoes in there that had been growing their own civilization." Something extraordinary happened then. Joel Ellsworth almost smiled. It was not a full smile, not yet. It was just the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth, there and gone in a second, as quickly suppressed as a reflex. But Maria caught it, and it lodged somewhere beneath her ribs like a splinter of warmth. He swung down from the horse and tied it off and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and when he turned around his expression had returned to its usual careful blankness, but his voice was a degree or two less flat when he said, "I will get to the fence posts along the north line tomorrow. If you want something to help with, there is mending in the chest at the top of the stairs." "I also know how to help with fence posts," she said. He looked at her. "Do you?" "I do." He seemed to be weighing this against something, some internal calculation she could not read the terms of. Then he said, 6 in the morning. Bring work gloves." He went inside, and Maria stood on the porch for a moment in the golden light, and she was smiling before she even realized it. Working alongside Joel Ellsworth in the early morning light was a revelation that she had not anticipated and did not quite know what to do with. She had expected silence, and there was silence, but it was not the hostile, empty silence she had encountered those first weeks. It was instead the concentrated quiet of a person who was genuinely focused on the work at hand. And once Maria fell into the rhythm of it herself, she found she did not mind it at all. They worked the fence line together, Joel setting the posts and tamping them down while Maria held the wire and handed tools and did what was needed without being asked twice. And after an hour of this he stopped and looked at her with an expression that was almost frankly surprised. "You actually know what you are doing," he said. "I told you I did. People tell me things." He drove in another post with 3 clean swings. "Mostly they are not true." "Has that been your experience generally, or specifically with regard to the women Mrs. Drummond sends out here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Generally." She picked up the wire stretcher and worked the slack out of the next section. "What was it like before, when the ranch was running well?" She asked it simply and without any of the particular careful gentleness that she had learned people used with him, the kind of gentleness that reminded him every time that he was fragile, that he needed to be handled. She asked it the way you ask someone about their work directly, with genuine interest. He looked at her sideways before answering. "Different," he said finally. "My father ran 500 head. We had 2 permanent hands and 1 seasonal. The south pasture grew hay enough to sell some to the Jennings farm. He drove another post. It can be that again. The land is still good. The water rights are intact. It just needs." He trailed off, and she could see him choosing not to finish the sentence. "It just needs someone living in it," she said. He drove the post and said nothing, but she saw his shoulders shift. They worked until mid-morning and came back to find Thomas up and making a sincere but chaotic attempt at cooking oatmeal on the stove, a project that had resulted in oatmeal on the stove, on the floor, and on a portion of the ceiling that neither Maria nor Thomas could explain. Maria took over without comment, cleaning up the mess with Thomas's earnest assistance, and she glanced up to find Joel leaning in the kitchen doorway watching his son, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet, something painful and tender and yearning, the look of a man who wanted very much to step forward and could not quite remember how. She thought about what Rosa had said. He looks at Thomas and sees Margaret, and it hurts too much to look for long. She thought about her own father, and the long years of watching him be present and absent in the same body, and the way she and her sisters had learned to navigate around his grief as carefully as you navigate around broken glass, trying not to be cut, trying not to cause him to be cut. She had loved him. She had also been very angry with him for a very long time, though it had taken her years to understand that the anger was not wrong, that you were allowed to love someone and also need more from them than they had been able to give. Thomas needed more than Joel had been able to give. That was simply true. And Joel, she was beginning to understand, needed someone to hold the door open long enough for him to remember that he was allowed back in. April deepened into May, and the ranch began, incrementally and haltingly, to come back to life. Joel hired a hand, a young Mexican man named Diego Reyes who was 17, steady, and had been looking for work since the ranch he had been on over near Del Rio had closed. He was quiet and competent and treated Maria with a respectful courtesy that she appreciated, and he had the useful quality of seeming to occupy exactly the amount of space the moment required, no more and no less. With Diego helping on the land, Joel came in for supper with regularity now, and the four of them, Joel, Maria, Thomas, and Diego, ate together at the kitchen table in the evenings. And slowly, gradually, like frost melting off a window pane, conversation began to happen. It started with Thomas, who had a question about everything and no longer felt any particular need to restrain himself from asking it. He asked Diego about the stars visible from Del Rio versus the stars visible from Dusthaven, a topic Diego engaged with surprising depth and enthusiasm. He asked Maria how she had learned to ride, and she told him about growing up near the stockyards in Abilene and watching cowboys handle horses from the time she was small, and deciding that she was going to learn everything they knew whether anyone taught her or not. He asked his father what the war had been like, and the table went very quiet, and Joel looked at his son for a long moment with that painful, unguarded look, and then he said, "It was very hard, and I am glad it is over, and I do not think it is good dinner table talk, but maybe one day I will tell you about the things that were worth keeping from it." Thomas accepted this with the gravity it deserved and moved on to asking Diego about the properties of different kinds of cactus, which turned out to be Diego's second favorite subject after astronomy. That night, after Thomas was in bed and Diego had gone to the bunkhouse, and Maria was washing the supper dishes, she heard Joel come back into the kitchen and pour himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. She had half expected him to take it upstairs as he usually did. Instead, she heard him sit at the table. She continued washing the dishes, giving him the space to be there without making it into something. After a while he said, "He looks like his mother." Said nothing, rinsing a plate carefully. "I know that is not an excuse," he continued, and his voice had a quality she had not heard from him before, something scraped down and honest that clearly cost him something. "I know that it is not the boy's fault and it is not fair to him. I know that," a pause, "knowing it has not always made it easier to be his father," Maria said quietly. "Yes." The word came out roughly. She set the last dish to dry and dried her hands and turned to face him. He was sitting at the table with both hands around his coffee cup, looking at the table surface, and there were lines on his face that spoke of something more than tiredness. "My mother died when I was 15, Maria said, sitting down across from him, not close enough to crowd, just present. "My father had 4 children and a farm and a grief that he could not put down for a single day of the 9 years he lived after her. He was not a bad man. He was not cruel. He just—" She picked at a small rough spot on the table edge. "He was inside something that he could not find the door out of, and we were on the outside of it and we needed him, and the needing was not enough to bring him through." Joel looked up at her and the Creekwater eyes were quiet and very intent. "Did you forgive him?" he asked. "I am still working on it." She met his gaze steadily. "But I will tell you this. I do not think he ever stopped loving us. I think he just lost the language for it. I think grief can do that. Take the language from you and leave you standing there with something enormous in your chest and no way to say it." Joel set down his coffee cup. He looked at his hands on the table for a long moment, and Maria watched something move through his face, something slow and heavy shifting toward light. "She would be very unhappy with me," he said. "Margaret, she was very—" A pause. "She made everything matter. The meals and the garden and the boy and the sunsets. She could make a Tuesday into something worth remembering. And after she went it all just seemed very small and pointless, and I did not know how to care about any of it anymore. I know. You have been here 2 months and you have repaired my roof and cleaned my cellar and taught my son to bake bread and put flowers on the table every week, and I have been treating you like furniture and you have not once complained about it." Maria smiled at that, a small, genuine smile. "I was not brought here to be treated well. I was brought here to do a job." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression had shifted to something careful and wondering, like a man who has been told a thing he does not know how to account for. "That is not true," he said quietly. "No one has to be treated badly to do a job." It was, she thought, the kindest thing he had said since she arrived, and he had said it not to her exactly but about her, which felt more honest somehow. "Go to sleep, Mr. Ellsworth," she said gently. "You are up at 5." He pushed back from the table and stood, and he was almost at the kitchen doorway when he stopped and turned back and said, "Joel." She raised an eyebrow. "My name is Joel," he said, with the particular stiffness of someone saying something that required more courage than it appeared to. "You do not have to keep calling me Mr. Ellsworth." "All right," she said. "Good night, Joel." He nodded once, and she heard his boots on the stairs, and she sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight for a good long while after that, thinking about the way a man saying his own first name could sound like the beginning of something. The summer that year came in hard and hot and stayed, the way a Texas summer will, and the ranch worked through it in long, sweating days that left everyone tired in the comfortable, satisfied way of real labor. The south pasture was cleared and planted for hay. Joel traded 2 horses at Dusthaven spring market and used the money for a new water pump and seed. And the kitchen garden that had been nothing but weeds when Maria arrived came up green and determined, and full of everything she had put into it. She and Joel fell into the habit of sitting on the front porch after Thomas was in bed, in the hour between full dark and sleep, when the heat had eased a little, and the coyotes were singing somewhere in the dark distance, and the stars overhead were so thick and low they looked like they could be reached. They talked about small things first, the next day's work, what Thomas had said that was funny or surprising, what news Diego had brought from town. Then gradually, almost without noticing, they began to talk about larger things. She told him about Abilene, about the stockyards and the cattle drives and the constant noise of it, about her sisters Ruth and Clara and her brother James, about Clara's marriage to a farmer in Kansas, and Ruth working at the schoolhouse and James driving cattle north on the Kishom Trail 2 seasons ago before he had stopped writing letters, which she worried about more than she said. About Mrs. Finch and the boarding house, and the 3 years of patching and mending and keeping things going that had given her more practical knowledge than any schooling she had received. He told her about the war, slowly and in pieces, the way you tell someone something that you have kept quiet for a long time, a piece at a time, as if testing whether the words will break you when they leave. He had gone in at 19, young and certain in the way of the young and the certain, and he had come back at 22 with the certainty burned out of him and something harder and sadder in its place. He did not tell her the worst of it. She did not ask. But she listened to what he offered, and she received it with the same steadiness she gave to everything, without flinching, without the careful pity he had clearly learned to dread. He told her about his father, who had died the year before the war ended, and about growing up on this land with its particular quality of light and its thorny beauty, and about the water rights dispute with a rancher named Caldwell over to the west that had been going on for 15 years, and that his father had always handled with more patience than Joel could manage, and that was apparently going to require attention sometime in the coming season. He told her about Margaret. Not all of it, not at first, but more than she had expected, and she understood what it cost him, and she did not rush him or try to soften any of it. He had loved his wife with the whole of himself, and she had died, and that was a fact that would always be a fact, and Maria did not try to make it otherwise. She simply sat beside him in the dark and listened, and sometimes she reached over and briefly laid her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail, not a long touch, just enough to say, "I am here," and he let it happen without pulling away, which told her more than anything else had. She did not examine too closely what was happening between them. She was not a fool, and she was not self-deceiving. She knew that the nightly conversations had taken on a quality that was something more than 2 people discussing the ranch. She knew that she noticed things about him now that were not strictly necessary to notice. The way he looked in the early morning light. The way his whole face changed when Thomas made him laugh. The way he sometimes watched her from across the yard with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her breath come a little differently. She knew that somewhere in the months she had been here she had stopped thinking of this as a job she was doing and started thinking of it as the place where she lived, and she knew that Joel Ellsworth was a significant part of why. She also knew that he was not ready for anything she might put a name to, and she was not in the habit of pushing what needed to come in its own time. The thing that changed it was an August evening and a coyote, and a considerable quantity of mud. Maria had gone to check on the kitchen garden after supper, because she had heard coyotes close the night before, and was worried about the chickens that had taken to roosting near the garden fence. She found the garden gate open, and one of the younger hens missing, and the evidence of a chase through the soft ground near the water barrel, and she followed the trail around the side of the barn in the failing light, and very nearly ran directly into Joel, who had clearly been on the same errand from the other direction and was carrying a lantern and looking extremely focused. They both stopped. They were very close in the narrow space between the barn wall and the fence, closer than they had yet been, and in the lantern light Maria could see every detail of his face clearly, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar along his jaw, the way his expression had shifted from focused to startled in the second before both of them realized simultaneously that they were standing in a rather significant patch of deep mud. Maria felt her boot go in first and attempted to correct her balance and overcorrected, and Joel reached out and caught her arm, and that prevented the fall but not entirely, and they both ended up in the mud in a manner that was ungraceful in the extreme, sitting in it rather than lying in it, which was something, though not much. For a second neither of them said anything. Then Maria looked down at herself, covered from the waist down in dark Texas mud, and she heard a sound that took her a moment to identify. Joel Ellsworth was laughing. It was not a polite laugh or a restrained laugh. It was a real one, full and surprised and unwilling, the laugh of a man who had not laughed in so long that his whole body seemed startled by it, his shoulders shaking and his head dropping forward and the lantern he still held swinging with the movement. It filled the narrow space between the barn and the fence, and it was the finest sound Maria had ever heard, and it turned her completely to pieces inside. She started laughing too, because the situation was objectively ridiculous, and because his laugh was absolutely irresistible, and they sat there in the mud in the August dark laughing until the lantern flickered, and the missing hen appeared from behind the water barrel looking entirely unconcerned. When the laughter subsided into something calmer, and they were simply sitting in the mud looking at each other, slightly breathless, the lantern light catching the gold at the tips of his hair and the tears of laughter at the corners of her eyes, there was a moment of quiet that was entirely different from all the other quiet moments they had shared. Joel looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen from him before, open and wondering and a little afraid, the face of a man who has arrived somewhere and is just now recognizing it. "Maria," he said, and the way he said it was different from every other time he had said her name. "Yes," she said, and she did not know exactly what she was saying yes to, but she meant it completely. He reached out slowly and tucked a strand of mud-damp hair back from her face, and his hand stayed there for a moment against her cheek, and his thumb moved once very carefully across her cheekbone. It was the most tentative and the most intentional gesture she had ever experienced, and she turned her face very slightly into his palm and he inhaled as if something had hurt him gently. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly, and it was entirely honest, no pretense in it. "I know," she said, equally honest. "Neither do I exactly, but I think we have managed things we did not know how to do before." He looked at her for a long moment, his hand still against her face, and then he said, "I think you might be the bravest person I have ever met." "I am sitting in a mud pit," she pointed out. "I know," he said. "That is not what I mean." She understood what he meant. She looked at him in the lantern light and thought about Mrs. Drummond saying broken beyond saving, and she thought about everything she had watched him carry these past months, and everything she had watched him put down, one piece at a time, slowly and without fanfare. She thought about Thomas reading aloud and Joel saying, "You read that well." She thought about the scar on his jaw and the laugh she had just heard for the first time and the hand gentle against her cheek. "I am not afraid of broken things," she said. "I told Mrs. Drummond that when she told me not to come. Broken things are the only kind I know how to love. My father was broken. The boarding house I grew up fixing was broken. Everything I have ever cared about started out cracked in some way." She paused. "But I want you to understand something. I am not here because I need something to fix. That is not what this is. I am here because you are worth being here for, you specifically, not a project." Joel was very still. Then he said, "I think I stopped believing I was worth much of anything to anyone." "I know," she said. "I noticed." He looked at her with that raw, careful look, and then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead very gently against hers, and they stayed like that in the warm August dark with the lantern swinging and the mud drying on their clothes and the hen regarding them from the fence post with magnificent indifference. "I would like to take you to supper in town," he said, "properly, if you would allow it." She smiled against his forehead. "I would allow it." They got up out of the mud and found the hen and put the garden gate to rights and went back inside, and nothing else happened that night. But something enormous had shifted, quietly and permanently, like a door that has been stuck for a long time finally finding its frame again. Joel took her to supper at the hotel dining room in Dusthaven 2 days later, which was a significant event in itself, because it required him to shave properly and put on his good shirt and walk into the most public space in town with her beside him, and Maria understood what it cost him and was grateful for it without saying so. Mrs. Drummond, whom they passed on the way in, looked at the two of them with an expression of such profound, barely contained astonishment that Maria had to look away to keep from laughing. The hotel dining room was not elaborate. 6 tables with white cloths and oil lamps, and a menu written on a chalkboard, but it felt to Maria like extraordinary luxury after months of kitchen suppers. They sat across from each other and ordered from the chalkboard, and Joel was quiet for the first part of the meal, not with the old absence, but with the new kind of quiet, the one she had come to understand as him gathering himself. He told her about his plans for the ranch through the autumn, the hay crop that was coming in well, the intention to trade for 2 good brood mares in the fall market, the Caldwell water rights situation which was going to require a lawyer or at least a very firm letter. And she listened and asked questions and offered observations, and they talked back and forth in the easy, genuine way they had developed on the porch at night. Except that here there were tablecloths and other people, and the lamp was close enough to the table that she could see his face in warm detail. He had gray at his temples that she had not noticed before. It made him look not older exactly but more settled, like a man arriving at himself. "What do you want?" he asked her over the apple pie that came at the end, and the question had a particular directness that told her he was not asking about the pie. "For myself," she considered it seriously. "I want to stay somewhere long enough to plant roots. I have not had that. I want to see Thomas grow up. I want to plant a proper herb garden. I want to know what this land looks like in winter." She looked at him steadily across the table. "I want to see what you look like when you are not carrying quite so much weight. I suspect it is something worth seeing." He met her gaze and held it, and she could see the thing in him that was building, the intention and the uncertainty together. "And what if I wanted you to stay?" he said. "Not as a housekeeper, as—" he stopped. "As someone who matters," she said. "Yes," he said, "that." She set down her fork and folded her hands on the table and looked at this man who had come so far in so few months from the hollow-eyed ghost of himself she had met in the doorway that first night, who had laughed in a mud pit and said his own first name to her and pressed his forehead against hers in the dark. And she thought that she had loved him longer than she had allowed herself to know it, and that this was one of those moments that only happen once and that you carry with you for the rest of your life. "Joel," she said, "I have not been considering leaving." He let out a breath that it seemed he had been holding for quite some time. They walked back from the hotel in the late evening light with their arms close enough together that the backs of their hands brushed, and then he took her hand in his, simply and without ceremony, and she laced her fingers through his, and they walked home to the ranch that way, through the mesquite and scrub brush and the warm, settling dark of a Texas August evening, hand in hand for the first time, and it felt like everything. September brought the hay harvest, and with it, a pair of experienced hands Joel hired to help bring it in. Two brothers named Will and Frank Sousa who were cheerful and capable and ate more at a single supper than Maria had thought possible. The south pasture came in better than Joel had expected, enough to sell a portion to the Jennings farm as his father had once done, the first time the ranch had sold anything in 3 years. Joel came in from the transaction with a look on his face that Maria had not seen from him before, something that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it, a man standing a little straighter because something he had worked for had worked. Thomas, who had appointed himself the official chronicler of the hay harvest and had a running commentary on everything, had also in the past month undergone a transformation that Rosa Vega noted with open satisfaction on one of her visits. "He is a different boy," Rosa said, watching Thomas show Diego the proper way to feed the horses, a procedure Thomas had invented in great detail and which Diego good-naturedly was following to the letter. "He talks all the time now. He is telling everyone he is going to be a scientist. He told me last week that he has been observing the coyotes and has several theories," Maria said. Rosa shook her head with a smile. "And his father?" Maria looked across the yard to where Joel was talking with Will Sousa about the hay bales, and her face did what it always did when she looked at him now, which was nothing she could prevent and nothing she tried to. "His father," she said, "is finding his way back." Rosa studied her for a long, warm moment. "You love him," she said, not as a question. Maria looked at her directly. "Yes," she said. "I do." Rosa smiled, broad and genuine. "I have been waiting to see that happen for 3 years," she said. "I had given up, if I am honest. I thought he was too far gone." She paused. "I think you were the only thing that could have worked, Maria, because you are not trying to make him into what he was. You are letting him be what he is becoming." Maria thought about that for a long time after Rosa left. The Caldwell water rights dispute came to a head in October in the way things come to a head in Texas in 1878, which is to say that Caldwell sent 2 men onto Ellsworth property to block the access channel, and Joel found them there at 6 in the morning, and there was a confrontation that involved a good deal of very cold and level speech on Joel's part, and a great deal more heated speech on the part of Caldwell's men, and which ended without violence, but in a state of clear standoff. Joel came back to the house that evening with a set jaw and a controlled quietness that Maria recognized as genuine anger being very carefully managed. "Tell me," she said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. He told her. Caldwell was a land grabber who had been encroaching on the eastern farms for 5 years, using legalistic maneuvering to chip away at the small operations that bordered his expanding property. The water rights agreement Joel's father had established was a direct obstacle to what Caldwell wanted, and he was clearly now making a direct move against it. "We need the water rights," Maria said. She had understood the significance of that agreement for months, not just for the ranch. The Jennings family, the Montoya farm over to the east, they both depend on the agreement holding. "Yes," Joel said. "Then we fight it legally. You said there is a lawyer over in Comanche you have used before. Roy Hicks. He is good. He will need the original agreement documents and the water survey my father commissioned in '62. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I have been putting this off because—" He stopped. "Because dealing with it means dealing with your father's things, and that is difficult," Maria said. He looked at her with the direct, undefended look he had been giving her more and more often now, the one that said she had said a true thing. "Yes, I will help you go through it if you want. I am very good at organizing papers." He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning." They spent the following morning in the study where Joel's father's papers were stored in a cedar chest that had not been opened in 3 years, and Maria sat across from Joel on the study floor with papers spread between them, sorting, cataloging, handing things across. It was close and careful work, and it required Joel to touch things his father had touched, to read documents in his father's handwriting, and she watched the cost of it move across his face without trying to manage it. At one point he found a letter, a personal one, and he read it in silence and then set it face down on the floor beside him and was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" she asked. "It is a letter from my father to my mother," he said. "Written before I was born." He did not look up. He was a better writer of letters than I knew. "Grief hides the things we knew people to be sometimes," she said. "It reduces them to the loss itself. It takes a while to get back to the rest." Joel looked up at her, and his expression was something she had come to think of as uniquely his, that careful, wondering, slightly disbelieving look, the look of a man who keeps being surprised that something good is real. "Where did you learn all of that?" he said. "Which part?" "The part about how to be kind to people without making them feel broken." She paused with a paper in her hand and looked at him squarely. "I learned it from wanting someone to do it for me, and not having anyone who knew how." He reached across the papers between them and took her hand, not the back of hand's brush of the walk home in August, but a full and deliberate taking of her hand in both of his, and he held it there between his palms on the study floor with the cedar smell of the chest around them and the autumn light coming in through the dusty window, and he looked at her with everything showing on his face, no walls, no distance, no hollow exhaustion, just the whole of him present and looking at her. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that I know it and I am not afraid of saying it." She felt it in every part of her, not a shock but a recognition, the way you recognize a song you have not heard in years. She turned her hand over in his and held him back. "I love you," she said. "I have for a long time." He brought her hand up to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and she felt the warmth of it all the way up her arm and down through the center of her, and she thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like, not a neat and careful thing but a whole and true one. Roy Hicks the lawyer came out from Comanche the following week and reviewed the documents, and his assessment was clear and firm. The water rights agreement of 1862 was valid and binding. Joel's father had been meticulous in its documentation, and Caldwell had no legal ground to stand on. Hicks sent a formal notice to Caldwell's attorney and made it clear that any further interference with the water access would be met with legal action. Caldwell backed down. Not graciously and not permanently perhaps, but for now and in the ways that mattered, the water rights held. The Jennings family sent over a smoked ham by way of thanks when they heard the news. The Montoyas sent a basket of late-season peppers and a note in careful English that said they were grateful and they were neighbors, and they would not forget it. Maria put the peppers in the kitchen and the smoked ham in the cool room and thought about what it meant to be part of something, a community of people holding each other's claims against the world. November arrived with a cold wind from the north, and the ranch settled into the quieter rhythms of the coming winter. On the evening of the 12th of November, Joel came into the kitchen while Maria was finishing the supper dishes and stood in the doorway, and when she turned around she saw that he had shaved very carefully and was wearing his good shirt for the second time since the hotel supper in August, and he was holding his hat in both hands. She dried her hands. He said, "I have been thinking about how to say this properly for a month, and I have not managed to settle on the right words, so I am going to say it plainly and you can tell me if it is too plain." "Plain is my preference," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because the ranch needs a woman in it, and not because Thomas needs a mother, though both of those things are true and I will not pretend otherwise. I want to marry you because you are the finest person I have ever known, and because you sat down in a mud pit with me and laughed, and because you took my father's papers out of a chest I could not open alone, and because when I say your name it is the clearest thing in my head on any given day." He stopped. The hat in his hands had been turned all the way around twice. "I know that I have not been easy to know. I know I am still not entirely repaired. But I would like to spend the rest of my life being worth the trouble you took on my behalf, if you will let me." Maria looked at this man who had traveled such a long road in 8 months, who had come from hollow and silent to present and speaking, and standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and she thought that all the broken things she had ever loved had never given her anything back before. They had only ever needed and given nothing in return, and she had loved them anyway because it was her nature to love what was cracked. But Joel Ellsworth had been different. Joel Ellsworth had been broken and had chosen in his own time and his own way to come back from it, and he had come back toward her, and the gift of being what someone was coming back toward was something she had not known was possible. "Yes," she said, and she was across the kitchen before he could take a breath, and he dropped the hat and caught her, both arms around her, solid and certain, and she put her face against the side of his neck and felt him breathe. They were married in December in the small white church with the crooked steeple in Dusthaven, on a cold, bright morning with the ground frozen hard, and the sky a particular winter blue that Maria would remember for the rest of her life. Mrs. Drummond was there, seated in the front pew with an expression of immense and tearful satisfaction that she was making absolutely no effort to contain. Rosa Vega sat beside her with her husband and her 3 daughters. Diego sat in the back, cleaned and combed and trying very hard to look unaffected. The Jennings family was there, and the Montoyas, and a dozen other faces from the town that Maria had come to know in the months she had been here. Thomas stood beside his father at the front of the church and was perfectly and wonderfully serious about his responsibilities, which he had decided included keeping his father's ring safe in his breast pocket until the correct moment. A responsibility he fulfilled with the focused intensity he brought to everything important, the same intensity with which he observed ants and coyotes and the properties of cactus. When Reverend Alcott asked Joel Ellsworth if he took Maria Carter to be his wife, Joel looked at her with clear and steady eyes and said yes with a certainty that filled the small church, and when he said it, Maria heard Mrs. Drummond make a small sound that was almost certainly a sob, and she thought that she would have to tease the woman about it later, but very gently. When it was her turn, she said yes too, and she meant it with every part of herself, the part that had come from Abilene with a patched saddlebag and a set jaw, the part that had grown up learning to love things that were broken, the part that had sat in a mud pit on an August evening and heard a man laugh for the first time in years, and she was entirely, perfectly certain. Joel kissed her in front of the church and the town and the cold December sky, and it was not a restrained or careful kiss. It was the kiss of a man who meant it, and she heard Thomas say something beside them that sounded like "finally" in a tone of profound 6-year-old relief, and the whole church burst into delighted laughter, and it was the best day she could remember having in a very long time. The winter passed in the warmth of the house they were building together, not just the physical house with its repaired roof and scrubbed floors and herb garden waiting under the snow for spring, but the living structure of a family reshaping itself around new love. Joel came in from the cold in the evenings and always looked for her first, a small thing, a quick thing, the kind of thing you only notice if you are paying attention, but Maria paid attention, and it made her glad every time. Thomas took to calling her Mama by his own decision, and with no fanfare about it, announcing it one morning at the breakfast table as if it were simply the accurate description and he had just been waiting to confirm it. And the word hit Maria somewhere very soft and stayed there. They wrote letters together to her sister Clara in Kansas, and got back a long, warm letter in response that said Clara had been hoping for exactly this kind of news, and was Maria happy? Was she truly happy? Maria wrote back and said yes, truly, and described the view from the front porch on a winter morning when the frost was on the mesquite, and the sky was the particular color of the hour after dawn, and said that she was home, actually and finally home. Her brother James sent a letter in February, which turned out to be what Maria had hoped and not what she had feared. James was alive and well, and had settled in Colorado with a mining operation, and had simply been too busy to write consistently. a habit for which he apologized without much apparent remorse. She wrote back immediately. Spring came, and with it, the kitchen garden and the herb border along the south wall that Maria had been planning all winter, and with it also the announcement, in April, that there would be a new person at the Ellsworth ranch by October. She told Joel on a Sunday morning while Thomas was at his lessons with Rosa Vega's eldest daughter Catalina, who had taken over the informal teaching arrangement with considerable enthusiasm. Joel was in the kitchen going over the ranch accounts at the table, and Maria came in from the kitchen garden and stood across the table from him and said, "I believe you should probably build a cradle." He looked up at her. She watched understanding move across his face in slow, clear stages, and what followed was not what she might have predicted from the man she had first met, the hollow, guarded man standing in his own doorway. What followed was a man rising from his chair and coming around the table and taking her face in both hands and looking at her for a long moment with a wonder that was full and uncontained. And then he kissed her forehead and her cheeks and the corner of her mouth, and he said against her hair, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly fine," she said, smiling. "More than perfectly fine." He held her there for a while, his arms around her and her face against his shoulder, and then he said, "I want you to know that I am not afraid. I was afraid before, of everything, of caring too much about something I might lose." He paused. "I am not afraid anymore." "I know," she said. "I noticed." He laughed, the full, easy laugh she had been hearing regularly now and never got tired of, and she felt it in his chest against her ear, and she thought that broken things, when they heal, do not heal back to what they were. They heal into something new, something that has earned its shape through difficulty, something that knows its own strength because it has had to find it. Joel Ellsworth was not the man he had been before the war or before Margaret died. He was a different man, a man who had been to the bottom and chosen to come back up, and she loved him not in spite of what had broken him but alongside it, the whole of him, every scar and every hard-won piece of him. Thomas reacted to the news with a combination of delight and intense practical curiosity. He immediately wanted to know the biological specifics, which Maria answered as accurately as the occasion warranted, and then he wanted to know whether it would be a boy or a girl, and when told that was unknowable in advance, he said that he would be happy either way, but that he had some theories about the optimal number of siblings and would like to discuss them at some point. Joel, who had been listening to this from the doorway, turned away quickly, and Maria was fairly certain his shoulders were shaking. The summer of 1879 on the Ellsworth ranch was the best summer Maria could have imagined. The hay crop was better than the year before. Joel had 3 permanent hands now, Diego and 2 new men, and the operation was running with the purposeful efficiency of a property that had recovered its direction. The brood mares he had purchased in the fall had both foaled in the spring, healthy, strong-legged colts that Thomas had named after planets, because he had decided that astronomical naming was both logical and distinguished. Jupiter was a bay, and Mars was a gray, and both of them were trouble in the corral, in the most endearing possible way. Maria was 7 months along by August, and had made the executive decision that she was going to keep working at everything she could manage. A decision Joel had accepted with the particular combination of concern and respect that he had developed for her preferences, which meant that he worried about her constantly, and said so once, and then respected her answer. He built the cradle himself, in the evenings in the barn while Thomas supervised with opinions about joinery, and it came out finer than either of them had expected, smooth-planed pine, with a small carved detail along the headboard that Maria discovered one morning when she went to look at it. A simple star shape, small and precise, cut into the wood with a steady hand. Thomas wanted there to be something on it, Joel told her when she came to find him in the yard. He suggested a coyote, Maria said. He did. I negotiated him down to a star. She looked at this man she loved, standing in the yard in the August morning light with sawdust on his shirt and his eyes clear and present. And she thought that this was what it looked like when someone came all the way back, and it was one of the finest things she had ever seen. Their son was born on the 3rd of October, 1879, in the room upstairs with the repaired roof above it, brought into the world with the assistance of the local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Parr, and Rosa Vega, who was there as a matter of course because Rosa had decided that if anything significant was going to happen on the Ellsworth ranch, she was going to be present for it. He was a strong boy, loud and pink and immediately opinionated about everything. And when Joel held him for the first time, he stood very still and looked down at the small face with an expression that Maria would keep with her for the rest of her life. Something so full and so tender and so entirely present that it made the whole long road of everything feel worth it. The road from Abilene with the patched saddlebag, the first night at the ranch, the silent evenings and the mud pit and the cedar chest and the church with the crooked steeple. "What shall we name him?" Joel asked, not looking up from the baby. Maria looked at them both, father and son, in the afternoon light. "I was thinking William," she said, "after your father, if you are willing." Joel looked up at her then, and she saw the thing that moved through his face, the thing that was grief and gratitude and love all at once, and he said, "Yes, I think my father would have been very glad." William Ellsworth was a loud and sturdy and curious infant who grew into a loud and sturdy and curious toddler who was deeply attached to Thomas from the first week of his existence. A fact that Thomas received with the dignity and gravity of someone who had been waiting for a research assistant. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because life in Crockett County, Texas, in the last years of the 1870s and into the early 1880s, was genuinely hard in all the ways the land and the time and the ongoing injustices of the era demanded. The dispossession of the Tejano ranchers along the border, which Joel watched with a grim and helpless anger, continued to reshape the landscape of the county in ways that were unjust and unavoidable for those caught in the middle of them. The Montoya family lost the eastern section of their land to a series of legal maneuvers by the same sort of men as Caldwell, and Joel lent them the use of his east pasture for 3 seasons while they fought it. And when they lost despite the fight, he was quietly furious about it and said so to Maria in the way he now said all the hard things to her, directly and without armor. "There is not enough of what is right in how this land gets claimed and kept," he said one evening, and she said no, there is not, and they sat with the truth of it together because some things could not be fixed, only witnessed honestly. But within the boundaries of what they could build and sustain and protect, they built and sustained and protected well. Thomas grew up to be precisely the scientist he had always intended to be, heading to Austin at 16 to a school that could accommodate the breadth and depth of what he wanted to know about the world. And Maria stood at the gate and watched him ride away with his books and his theories and his carefully organized notes about coyotes. And she cried without any embarrassment about it, and Joel put his arm around her shoulders and said, "He will be all right. He is the most prepared person for anything I have ever seen in my life." "He is," she said, leaning into him. "I know he is. I am allowed to cry about it anyway." "You are allowed to do whatever you want," he said. "That is an enormously permissive position for a husband. I have found it to be the wisest one." She laughed through her tears, and he kissed the top of her head, and they stood at the gate together until the road dust settled. William turned 3, and then 4, and became, as he had always promised to be, a force of nature with the particular kind of concentrated intensity that both of his parents recognized from their own respective histories. He was Joel's height and Maria's stubbornness and Thomas's curiosity, in a combination that kept everyone at the ranch perpetually interested. In the spring of 1883, when William was 3½ and full of ideas about horses, Maria told Joel that William was going to have a sibling, and this time he did not stand still and hold her face. This time he picked her up, right there in the kitchen garden, and turned her around once in the spring air, and she was laughing before her feet left the ground. "I am carrying a child," she protested. "I know," he said, setting her down carefully and holding her steady by the arms and grinning at her, the full, unguarded grin that she had worked so hard to see that first August, the one that had rewired her understanding of what she was doing on this ranch. "I am very happy. I can see that. I built one cradle already. I can build another. Maybe without the star this time. William has claimed the star. I will put something else on it. Thomas can suggest the astronomical alternative." Their daughter arrived that November, dark-haired and brown-eyed and immediately loud about her opinions, and they named her Alina, which had been Maria's mother's name, and Joel put a moon on the cradle headboard without anyone asking him to. The Ellsworth Ranch in the years that followed was the kind of place that people came to and stayed, not always permanently, but long enough to know that it was a place where things were done well and people were treated as people. Diego had long since become the foreman, competent and trusted, and part of the family in the way that the years and the work and the shared table will make you. Rosa Vega's visits had become less a checking up and more a coming to visit friends, which was what they were. Mrs. Drummond retired from the general store when Maria was 29 and came out to the ranch on the occasion with a bottle of good whiskey and the expression of a woman who had seen all the outcomes she had hoped for and was very satisfied. "I told you he was broken beyond saving," she said, accepting the coffee Maria poured for her. "You did," Maria agreed, "and I was wrong. You were not entirely wrong. He was very broken." Maria looked out through the kitchen window at the yard, where Joel was teaching William to handle a lasso with the patient, focused attention of a man entirely present in his own life. He just needed the right kind of company while he found his way out of it. "And what is the right kind of company?" Mrs. Drummond asked. Maria watched her husband crouch down next to their small son and show him again, slowly, how to hold the rope, and William's face was screwed up in concentration, and Joel was speaking quietly and seriously, and treating the boy's effort with the full and genuine respect of someone who knew what it meant to be seen. "Someone who is not afraid of broken things," Maria said, "and who knows that broken does not mean worthless, it just means it needs more care." Mrs. Drummond was quiet for a moment. "You said something like that when I told you not to go. I told you he was broken beyond saving, and you said broken things were the only kind you knew how to love. I remember. I thought it was foolish then. I know. I think it might be the wisest thing I have ever heard," Mrs. Drummond said. Maria smiled and poured more coffee. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, December of 1883, Joel came in from the barn to find Maria on the front porch in the cold, wrapped in a heavy shawl, looking out across the ranch in the winter dusk. The south pasture was gold in the last light, and the hay barn was full for the winter, and somewhere in the house behind her, she could hear William asking Diego elaborate questions about the stars and Alina being carried on Rose's hip, audible by the particular contented sound she made, like a small singing machine. Joel came and stood beside her at the porch rail, the one he had finally replaced in full last spring, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into the solid warmth of him. "5 years," he said. "Yes. I have been trying to think of how to account for it, what it has been. I keep coming back to the same word and I am not sure it is sufficient." "What word?" "Everything," he said. "It has been everything." She turned her face up to look at him. This man she had come to on a roan mare with a patched saddlebag and a set jaw. This man who had been so still and so hollow the first time she looked at him. This man who laughed now with his whole body and who built cradles with carved moons, and who had taught his son to handle a lasso with real and careful patience. "Yes," she said. "I think that is sufficient." He kissed her there on the porch in the December cold, under the enormous Texas stars, and the lights from inside the house fell out across the yard, warm and steady, and inside Alina made her contented sound, and William was asking Diego whether the moon was bigger in winter, And this was the life she had built out of what had seemed to everyone else like something past saving, out of a broken ranch and a broken man, and her own hard-won knowledge that broken things were not finished things. They were just things that were waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough and clear-eyed enough to see them for what they could become. She had been that person. She had always been that person. It just took the Ellsworth ranch to give her the room to know it. The years that followed were long and full and good. The ranch grew and settled into itself, the kind of place that has roots deep enough to bend in hard seasons without breaking. William grew up with his father's steady hands and his mother's fearless practicality, and became in time a fine horseman and a good man, the kind of man who treated everyone on his property with the same respect his father had learned to give. Eleanor grew up with her mother's jaw and her father's eyes, and a laugh that could be heard from the far pasture. And she had opinions about everything from the proper training of horses to the injustice of the ongoing treatment of the Tejano families still being pushed off their lands, opinions she expressed clearly and without apology. Thomas came back from Austin with a degree in natural sciences and a long, careful letter of thanks to Maria that made her sit at the kitchen table and cry for 20 minutes. And Joel came in and found her crying and sat down beside her and read the letter and was quiet for a while and then said, "He always knew what you did for him, even when he was 6. "I know," she said. "I just needed to hear it in writing." Maria Carter became Maria Ellsworth and remained both, the woman who had ridden into Dusthaven with nothing but her capable hands and her stubborn heart, and the woman who had built a life and a home and a family on the particular truth she had always known, that the thing everyone called broken was often just the thing that had been honest enough to show its cracks, and that such things deserved not pity but company, not repair but love. And on long evenings in the years that stretched forward, she sat on the repaired porch of the Ellsworth ranch with her husband's arm around her and her children's voices in the house behind her and the big Texas stars overhead, and she thought that she had been right about broken things. She had always been right about broken things. They were the finest kind.